Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mejgan Massoumi, a graduate affiliate with the Center for South Asia, and I'm delighted to serve as the moderator for today's session. Before I introduce our speakers to you, I would like to acknowledge that this is a Stanford-sponsored event, and we recognize that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. As a scholar of history who studies global mass media in the region, particularly via radio, I'm very excited by the recent work and research of our panelists today and the diverse perspectives being brought to the table from the fields of history and from media and communications. My work is on the history of radio in Afghanistan in the 20th century, and I explore the transnational cultural connections made possible by mass media, music, and art across diverse communities. And it's interesting to recognize the cultural legibility across the vast geography of Afghan, Pakistan, India, despite nationalism's attempt to create borders and separations between these communities. So to be in conversation with two scholars who examine these critical moments of national identity is a treat for me, but sort of gives us an important conversation about how media has always been embedded in a larger discourse about how people come to understand their own national identity through images and sounds on screen. Today, we are delighted to host Dr. Salma Siddique and Dr. Wazhmah Osman. Salma Siddique is a historian and ethnographer who specializes in South Asian cinema and immigrant media studies. Her first book, Evacuee Cinema, Our Partition History of Cinema in South Asia, which we will learn more about today, recovers film genres and biographies from national amnesias shaped by partition based on new archival discoveries made in India, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom. Her work has been published in the journals Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, Social Text, Feminist Media Histories, Third Text, and Bioscope. In March of 2021, Salma will begin a 3-year-long research project on film spectatorship in urban South Asia, which is funded by the DFG at Humboldt University in Berlin. Welcome, Salma. Our second speaker is Wazhmah Osman. Wazhmah Osman is assistant professor in the Department of Media Studies and Production at Temple University. Her research and teaching are rooted in feminist media ethnographies that focused on the political economy of global media industries and the regimes of representation and visual culture they produce. Her first book, which will also feature in our discussions today, is titled Television and the Afghan Culture Wars, brought to you by foreigners, warlords, and activists. And this was published by the University of Illinois Press in 2020. She has appeared as a commentator on Democracy Now!, NPR, and Al Jazeera, and works with community and activist groups. She previously worked in television and film production for major American and international media institutions, and as an independent journalist and filmmaker. Her critically acclaimed documentary film, Postcards from Tora Bora, have been shown in festivals around the world, and I fondly remember having the opportunity to screen it at UC Berkeley after its initial release. Welcome, Wazhmah. And I want to thank both of our speakers for joining us from very different time zones today to make the event possible. Salma joins us from Germany and Wazhmah from the East Coast. Each of our speakers will have about 20 minutes or so to present their work to us, and then I'll pose some questions and guide us through the Q&A session. Also, if you would like to submit a question to our speakers either during the talk or after in our Q&A session, please use the Q&A box in Zoom, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. So without any further delay, let us begin with our first speaker, Dr. Salma Siddique.
Thank you, Mejgan, Lalita, and Simrat for inviting me to the lecture series. And today I will talk about film cultures in the aftermath of partition in Pakistan. The discussion is part of my forthcoming book on the constitution of two separate filmmaking nations, India and Pakistan, after the Great Division of 1947. In particular, I focus on migrant film personnel, namely actors and directors, whose active careers were inflected by the appearance of new national borders. Against the individual trajectories of endurance, I also bring forth the deliberations on creating a national film industry in Pakistan. When looking back at the early film culture, many journalists, filmmakers, and distributors in Pakistan repeated an enigmatic word to me, charba. It referred to both the process of copying as well as the copied product. Since in Pakistan, charbas were copies of Indian films, a disparaging tone was invariably marshaled to strongly dismiss a film or a filmmaker that participated in the charba phenomena. The discomforting status of charbas is evident in the Pakistani Film Committee report of 1960-61, referring to the practice as the primrose path of plagiarism, and the committee saw it as an act of piracy or undue veneration of foreign films. However, the pervasiveness of the phenomena suggests that copying or remaking was a meaningful production strategy in post-partition Lahore, a city which, while struggling with the impact of violence and dislocation of 1947, was being projected as the national film center of Pakistan. While the cultural elites of Pakistan saw cinema as a medium for unfettered and independent cultural expression of the new Muslim nation, the Charbas, in contrast, created a purposeful entanglement that ran contrary to the hegemonic vision of a separate film culture. In this tension between new national aspirations and old colonial connections, one can locate the logic of Pakistani charbas. These cinematic repetitions actually allow an acting out and working through the historic strain of partition. And I'll share the PowerPoint. Yeah. So to see charbas as or remakes as cinematic repetitions, offering collective spaces of overcoming trauma, hinges on the intimacy that partition shares with the category. These charbas are talked by dislocation. This dislocation refers to film migration, division and movement of film publics, and territorial shifts that new boundaries bring in. Paralleling these different strands of dislocations, there are different modus operandi of charbas. The most common approach to charbas involved an expeditious copying of post-partition Bombay films, which were running to packed houses in India, but were finding it difficult to cross the national borders. The Jal agitation of 1954, which is a very kind of important landmark in the film history of Pakistani cinema, the Jal agitation of 1954, led by the producers and actors of Pakistani film, was demanding a protectionist national film market and a quota system to regulate the inflow of Indian films. This move ushered in an increasingly segmented film market in South Asia from the late 1950s. So we need to remember that 1947 didn't mean a break in terms of markets. It's actually something that happens gradually in the 50s. Pakistani films barely got across to the Indian side, and a lesser number of new Indian films in West Pakistan offered the opportunity to duplicate without any risk of losing audiences. And suggestive of the remaking trail, the 1950s saw the transformation of the importer distributor, actually, the figure of the distributor, into producers and film financiers, churning low quality but faithful copies of new Indian films. And there are many films at this time, such as Data, which is a remake of an Indian film, Nastik, or Naukar, which is a remake of Aulad, Shahida, Lakhte Jigar, remakes of Vachan. Now, remaking was also intimately tied to genre choices and the enduring popularity of the Oriental fantasy films and quasi-historical dramas in post-partition South Asia. This involved a throwback to the Qissa Jadoo films, or the ones that were based on the Arabian Nights fantasies. And what we see here is that the competitive impulse of the silent era and the early talkies sort of returns. In 1957, two adaptations of the Laila Majnu legend were released on the same day in Pakistan. Now, this was neither the first instance of Laila Majnu's cinematic adaptation, nor even that of a competitive release of two Laila Majnus. In 1931, two rival film companies of colonial India, Madan Studios in Calcutta and Krishna Movietone in Bombay, produced two Laila Majnus simultaneously. The legend had also been remade in post-partition Bombay as Laila Majnu, directed by K. Amarnath. The other instances of Oriental fantasies included Gul Bakauli, made in Pakistan in 1961, and Anarkali, languages in the subcontinent and across different filmmaking cities, including colonial Lahore. Finally, an important impulse of remaking was self-citation, or a redo, where migrant personnel repeated their Bombay successes in Lahore. This could involve switches in language or adapting to the changed national milieu. So, for instance, filmmaker Nazir, who had left Bombay for Lahore, remade his film Gaon Ki Gori, The Village Girl, in Punjabi this time in Lahore as Phere, The Wedding Vows. While S.M. Yusuf, who also migrated to Pakistan in 50s, corrected the love triangle of his Bombay film Saheli for Sharia law, and this time could achieve a polygamous arrangement in the Pakistani version. And child actor Ratan Kumar elaborated and extended his migrant stardom by acting in a number of charbas. And I'm going to talk about Ratan Kumar today. I use Ratan's star trajectory as a methodological tool to excavate the migrant or Muhajir film experience. Here, what we observe is not only the doubling effect of Charbaz, but also the fact of his double roles after arrival in Pakistan. I reevaluate these derided and minor films through the concept of the doppelganger to understand certain tropes of derided doubling, including preposterous double roles, poor copies, fantastic doubles, revealing the copy as generative and constitutive of what is repressed by the original. Ratan Kumar, whose real name was Sayyid Nazir Ali, was a child star, a child actor, who started his film career in independent India in the late 1940s. Becoming the quintessential child of popular Hindi cinema, Ratan played key childhood roles in landmark Hindi films of the early 1950s. By 1956, he had reportedly worked in close to 50 films. Notable among these were neorealist inspired Bombay films like Do Bigha Zameen by Bimal Roy and Boot Polish by Prakash Arora, but also in fantasy films like Baghdad, Laila Majnu, legends such as Baiju Bawra, Bahut Din Hue, and mythologicals like Jai Mahalakshmi, Radha Krishna, and Ekadashi, as well as socials like Afsana, Sargam, and Jagriti. As genres and circuits of Hindi cinema go, this is quite a comprehensive inventory. While mostly Ratan played the childhood roles of leading heroes in Do Bigha Zameen, Boot Polish, Bahut Din Hue, and Jagriti, he occupied the key narrative space of a child protagonist. So, successfully commanding the image of the national orphan in India for almost a decade, Ratan migrated to Pakistan in 1956. The tensions between the star as person and his image, which has been pointed out by Richard Dyer in his study of stardom, became observably heightened with migration in case of Ratan Kumar, as his star persona stood at the risk of being emptied of meaning in Pakistan. What happens then is that Ratan's stardom was remade through Charbaz with two identifiable impulses, competitive or retaliatory, and nostalgic. While the competitive Charbaz involve a disavowal of his Indian past, the Charbaz of hybrid fantasies selectively retrieve his image of the Indian Oriental fantasy films, thereby conveying loss. So, very quickly, I'll talk about Charba as retaliation. And so Jagriti was one of his last films in India. And as you can see on this slide, Ratan Kumar occupied a really prominent space in the film poster, even though his character is killed off in the film. So Jagriti was themed around the pedagogical preparation of young sons of India as its future guardians, and emphasized a motivated vigilance regarding the nation's past and present to secure the hard-earned freedom. The suffering and wronged Mother India, a favorite representation in the late colonial period, is embodied in Shakti's mother. Shakti is played by Ratan Kumar in this film. And it's the inclusive yet equivocal maternality that is central to making meaning in Jagriti. The two boys here, Ratan and Ajay, personify the divided geographies. Played by Ratan, Shakti's incapacitated existence referenced the famous words of M.A. Jinha on a maimed, mutilated, and moth-eaten Pakistan. Shakti's disability, accident, and death as a violent loss affecting transformation could well signify the partition of the subcontinent, especially of Bengal in the east. Enacting the imperfection and death of the nation which Ratan eventually migrated to required a disavowal in the same affective currency as the one cobbled together by Jagriti. Bedari, which was a very close remake of Jagriti, was made in Pakistan and was child star Ratan's declaration of allegiance to Pakistan, which could only be constituted through a blow-by-blow dismantling of all that he had done in Jagriti and what Jagriti had done to him. Retaliation was a way of managing the contradiction that was threatening to burst at the seams of Ratan's charisma. And in this film, Ratan has a double role. He plays both the invalid boy and also the able-bodied protagonist in the film. So through the double role, Ratan was redeemed as an able-bodied Pakistani while relegating the blame of past deeds to the other character. And I'll show two clips, first from the film Jagriti, and then from Bedari, and they're the songs which were basically remakes of each other. So this was the Indian version, which was an ode to Mahatma Gandhi and the so-called peaceful achievement of independence. The second song is from the film Bedari, and you'll see Ratan Kumar again here, this time singing an ode to Muhammad Ali Jinha. Sorry. Significantly enough, Bedari challenged Jagriti where it truly hurt, that is, by making partition paramount. Insofar as Jagriti celebrated Gandhi's nonviolent leadership of India's independence, this had been made possible only by a careful avoidance of partition. On the other hand, in this song, Bedari filled the visual space with newsreel footage of refugee camps and the migrating populace, turning a representational constraint on its head by giving a colonial documentary form an Islamic spin, in which willingly leaving one's homeland for the sake of faith has a strong resonance. While the eulogy to Gandhi identifies colonialism as the enemy and extols the virtues of nonviolence, its counterpart in Bedari identifies Gandhi as the enemy by using the Indian News Parade film footage of the Gandhi Jinnah Bombay negotiations of 1944. Bedari's eulogy ultimately posed the question of what was more exceptional, the independence of India or the attainment of Pakistan. While the partition footage besmirched Pakistan, which saw nearly 7 films in 3 years, lasted until the early 60s. These were the costume or fantasy films like Nagin, 1959, Aladdin Ka Beta, Nilofar, Taj aur Talwar, Ghazi bin Abbas, Sher-e-Islam, Husn-o-Ishq. In contrast to the more Islamized fantasy hybrids of its time, Ratan starrer Nagin, made in 1959 and directed by Khalil Kaisar, drew on the Hindu Jataka tradition of divine mythical serpents and their descendants. 5 years earlier, another Nagin, directed by Nand Lal Jaswant Lal, had been made in Bombay and even officially exhibited in Pakistan. And of course, there's a pre-partition instance from the early Talkie period, which was Nagin, made in 1934, produced by Radha Film Company and directed by Jyotish Banerjee. While the earliest Nagin does not survive, Lahore's Nagin in its relationship with Bombay's Nagin is an instance of a remake. So it's promoted on the basis of its supposed similarity, but it only incidentally resembles it. And this is what Thomas Leach mentions in his work on uh, remakes. So the Pakistani Nagin, which is, this is the Pakistani poster of the Pakistani Nagin. The Pakistani Nagin revolves around the legendary devotion of the Cobra couple, whose love survives separation and the adoption of human form. Hunted by a snake charmer, the serpent boy Ratan seeks refuge on a princely lord's estate and switches places with the landlord's son, who's also his look-alike and double. In a classic case of mistaken identity, separated lovers, and multiple villains, several sword fights and snake bites later, both characters played by Ratan emerge triumphant. One lives on as the princely successor, and the other with his serpent sweetheart as snakes of the jungle. Now, Nagin is the first film that cast Ratan as a romantic male lead. It was Ratan's second double role in Pakistan and was imbued by his Indian past. We can see this instance in the poolside sequence, song sequence style show. As the Cobra boy enters the Nawab's palace grounds, he witnesses his look-alike serenading a young girl bathing in an open pool. With an Afghani rabab in his hand and dressed in a puffed-sleeved ornate costume, the boy leans against huge metallic and decorative cobra hoods lining the pool. In the Muslim princely Orient, there lurks a reminder of lands more east than west of Pakistan. It is a reminder of Ratan's cinematic Indian past, especially Bahut Din Hue, where the divine serpent king, Sheshnag, was the guardian of little Ratan's clan. In mythological lore, this mythical serpent protected infant Krishna, a role played by Ratan in the mythological films in India. The song itself recalls the innumerable representations of a playful Krishna teasing the bathing gopis. And in her study of the subversive potential of fantasy, Rosemary Jackson argues that the desire for what is experienced as loss and absence is central to fantasy. So this is the poolside sequence, song sequence from Nagin. So the pleasures of Hindu Jataka tales and Ratan's Indian past are the loss evoked in these Charba fantasies, in this Charba fantasy especially. So to conclude, I'd say that Ratan's intensified star presence, and I'm quoting Nipa Majumdar's work on doubling and stardom, Ratan's intensified star presence in the double roles was a proud showcase of the Lahore film industry's newly acquired trophy from India. Such a register of competition was consistent with the retaliatory and nostalgic postures of his intertwined constituencies, Charba and hybrid fantasies, themselves exercises in duplication. Characterizing the larger production trends of post partition Lahore, the popularity and resilience of fantasy and remakes were in part a result of a protectionist home market, but also a business solution designed to overcome the problem of low production and high demand. Wresting control of narrative traditions and historical events shared with India, the remakes confronted the hegemony and historicity of Indian cinema. As technically poor copies of their Bombay counterparts, often lacking magical spectacle and technical sophistication, these films conducted a dialogue of national difference. As an extension of the qualities that the original lacks, the Pakistani doubles, roles, and films were ultimately confrontations with self identity and its entanglements with the ineradicable past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salma. That was a wonderful presentation. I'd like to now invite our second speaker, Dr. Wazhmah Osman. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that great presentation, Salma Jan. And I also wanted to thank the Center for South Asia, particularly Mejgan, Lalita, and Simrith, as well as the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies for sponsoring this talk. I'm looking forward to our discussion afterwards. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about post 9/11 media, so more contemporary media in Afghanistan. Basically, give a book talk on my new book, as Mejgan Jan said, Television and the Afghan Culture Wars. But I also want to mention that, let me actually share my slides first. Okay, so you should be able to see my slides now. But as I was saying, I also wanted to mention that the culture wars are earlier culture wars and early media from, different decades in Afghanistan plays a central role in terms of how contemporary media makers frame their work, particularly their more activist and reformist work. I'll move on to this. So I'm in terms of what drew me to write this book and to this research, it was predominantly the prevailing negative images of Afghans as savages, militant, and barbaric, which has impacted myself and my communities. And this is something that is also not unique to Afghanistan. It's across the board in Central and South Asia, and colonized countries in the global South and East have often been portrayed in this way. The dominant discourse goes to say that that our attempts at modernity and nation building and statecraft have been failures in many respects. And so I wanted to counter that. And I'll mention that Stanford University professor and historian Robert Cruz offers a refreshingly alternative view in his book, Afghan Modern, one that focuses on historical change and global interconnections, which I'm excited that this panel does as well. And he explains how this insidious prevailing racist image has endured from Rudyard Kipling to Winston Churchill. And I quote him, he says, "The most enduring image of Afghanistan evokes a desolate, inward-looking and isolated place." Goes on to say that oftentimes the people were thought to be primitive and immobilized in time and space, and quotes a French ethnologist who essentially says that Afghans do not have a history because anarchy has none. And today in development circles and international relations and political science and some other fields, these earlier colonial tropes have been replaced by other problematic theories of what's called third world despotism or the rentier state or late state formation. But essentially all have a similar gist of describing the region in a way that is steeped in failure. And with the troubling rise of the Taliban in the 1990s and the attacks on the World Trade Center, post 9/11, Afghan people were further stereotyped in the mainstream Western media and popular culture, which was evident in the proliferation of many films and TV programs, documentaries, books, and the news that focused on the plight on their plight under repressive regimes, without accounting for actual or potential agency. And in particular, women fell into this victim trope. And scholars have written about how this was used to justify the American military assault on the Taliban in Afghanistan, and all women became extreme victims of backwards, misogynist Afghan men, and Afghan culture was interpolated as static, unchanging, and bound by problematic traditions. And yet, while this discourse pertaining to gender in Islamic countries has been reverberating globally, little attention was given to cultural productions that constitute contesting claims of identity and global and gender subjectivity and the daily lives of people. So with my book, I wanted to use an ethnographic approach to redirect the global dialogue about Afghanistan to local Afghans themselves. In other words, how do Afghan institutions talk back to discourses pertaining to them that have been reverberating globally on an unprecedented volume and scale? By considering local cultural contestations and social movements, I hope to complicate false binaries between religiosity and secularism and simplistic discourses of progress, development, humanitarian and human rights interventions. The mutability of culture and cultural contestations come into focus via grounded work and a rereading of the archive, which challenges the dominant view of Afghans, and I would say more broadly, South Asians and other people from the global South and East as tribal despots who are incapable of modernizing and statecraft, of which media is, of course, a central part of. So television in the Afghan culture wars is the first in-depth ethnographic study of the emergence of media in post 9/11 Afghanistan. Over the last 2 decades, Afghanistan has experienced a surge in media creation, dozens of free broadcast television and radio stations, which Mejgan studies and works on, have been created, a fledgling internet infrastructure, as well as mobile telephone companies have been set up. Most of the funding for this rapid media proliferation comes from the international donor community, including the neighboring countries and Western nations. My research relies on 2 methodologies, which are content analysis of the most popular genres on Afghan television, as well as my ethnographic studies into their production and reception. I interviewed everyone from high to low level producers, government officials, and a cross section of the population in order to analyze what the motivations from the producers were and what the needs of audiences are. Okay, so at its core, my project grapples with the legacy of development communication and critiques globalization theories that dismiss cultural imperialism as too outdated a framework through which to understand the dynamic scope and unpredictability of current transnational media flows. Predicated on feminist media ethnographies and political economy approaches, globalization alone cannot adequately describe the structural imbalances or the cultural and ideological issues that my study raises. Given the state of the world, including the ongoing wars in the MENISA, the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, the global refugee crisis, and transnational interventions, it's not surprising that both cultural imperialism as a thesis and development communication of the 1950s through the 1970s are reemerging and being built upon by scholars to make sense of contemporary geopolitics and the role of the media. Oftentimes, however, these schools of thought are oppositional, but in television and the Afghan culture wars, I show how the international donor communities, the international community more general, their interventions in Afghanistan have resulted in media imperialism as well as yielding positive media development projects, along with some problematic and misguided projects as well. This is a closer view of the funding chart, which was produced by SIGAR, which is the Office of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. It was an office that was mandated by the US Congress to be created in order to provide oversight of US reconstruction expenditures, which, as you can see, number in the billions. And if you take the total cost of war there, it's over $1 trillion. And SIGAR has, in the process over the last decade, exposed numerous cases of fraud and misappropriation of monies. Having poured millions of dollars into media in the Middle East, the US government certainly wants to generate pro-US government content and ideology. However, local producers are able to, in a number of instances, assert their own creative and political agendas. This is not to say that there are not egregious cases of media censorship and imperialism. There are, and we can see this with examples from Arab language media such as Radio Sawa and Al-Hora TV, which are mandated by US funders not to be critical of Israel. Likewise, most US-funded Afghan television stations are incentivized not to cover civilian casualties, as well as other reports that portray the US war, now going on to over 2 decades, and has become an unpopular, what's called now the forever war, in a negative light. These are clear examples of US propaganda and media imperialism. However, I believe it is important to distinguish between the malevolent and better ones, because it is in these spaces, the gaps and interstices between them, that the agency and freedom to deviate from the prescribed script and messages can manifest and thrive. It is this long leash approach to development communication that can enable local producers to bite the hand that feeds them. So two of the concepts that I possess in the book are the idea of a imperial gaze and a development gaze, which are built upon Laila Boulaghad's work, as well as Michael Schutzen and Timothy Mitchell and many others. And so what I talk about is that a technocratic rule is emerging, which is essentially a rule of the expert class who use science and technology to achieve control over and mastery of society, and that this gaze presents itself in terms of geopolitical dominance via military and market expansion, of which examples you can see are resource extraction, election, engineering, and of course, media and communication, influence and censorship. And so the question that comes up is, what is wrong with the merger between scientific method and governance? Don't we want that over a rule of non-experts? So what I argue is that the danger lies in its coupling with imperialism and military and economic dominance, which gives godlike power to technocrats. With a wave of their development wand, they can and they have entirely remade, transformed, and slashed and burned countries. And according to Bombay, destroying infrastructure is a key aspect of the rebuilding process, as is building parallel but different structures for elite classes and the rest of the population. Today, the US wields incredible power over all facets of Afghan life, including death, culture, and geopolitics. However, Afghanistan's asymmetrical positionality is not simply one of unilateral subjugation. Rather, Afghans see themselves as neither victims or free agents, but as negotiators, diplomats, and hagglers who have always had to make tough compromises in order to maintain a shaky sovereignty. And this is true of the media makers that I interviewed and engaged with as well. And on the contrary, the good development projects tend to be participatory, collaborative, and grounds up. So moving on to the popular genres, while Afghanistan is awash in foreign media from all over the world, American media products, for the exception of reality TV, are in fact not popular. The most popular media are local and transnational collaborative media, including B-movies, as well as Indian and Turkish dramatic serials. Afghan people's needs for justice via more serious programming and entertainment via more fun programming are not mutually exclusive. We cannot underestimate the value of entertainment in war-torn countries such as Afghanistan. In the reception chapter of my book, I also show why for Afghan people, and especially for Afghan women, they have not embraced more didactic programming that are sometimes sponsored by Western supported TV programming about women's rights, but have instead found Indian and Turkish serials as well as DIY Afghan B movies and homosocial all women theater more liberating and enjoyable. And for Afghan women who face victimization on a daily basis, steeped in a misogynist world of warlordism and Islamism, when afforded the opportunity and privilege of consuming media, they want a media world that is the opposite of their brutal reality. While Islamists attack foreign soap operas on the grounds of immorality, their large fan base find them valuable for generating debates over domestic and gender issues at home and in the public. And here you see examples of two popular Indian programs in Afghanistan, as well as one of the most popular Afghan productions or dramatic serials, which is called Khat Seom, which I know Mejgan and I are both big fans of. Okay, so the gun-toting villains, usually sisters, mothers, and aunts-in-law who scheme against the protagonist couples, were particularly enjoyable and empowering for women viewers. These genres offer a subversive space where women can escape and challenge the male gaze and patriarchal social order and control. They want a world where they are the heroes and saviors, a world where they not only have the power to save themselves, but also the nation. Sabah Sahar, who you see on the top left, is an actress, police officer, and film director. She has created her own film franchise, Sabah Films, which is quite popular. In her films, she's portrayed a powerful range of characters, such as a general, a police officer, a police sergeant, actually, and a traditional horseback riding women warrior. So I interviewed her along with other women media makers there. And last year, she was the target of an assassination attempt, which she luckily survived. So I'm going to wrap up shortly. Moving on to reality television, Western media corporations and governments support these competition-based shows, and they attract large international advertisers. For example, large Western corporations such as Simon Cowell's, Cisco TV, and Sony Picture Television own the rights to One TV's Afghanistan's Got Talent and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire franchises. And while these large corporations and advertisers, also such as Roshan, an Aga Khan funded telecom provider, support programs like Afghan Star, the Afghan format of American Idol, Pop Idol, and the X Factor. The ideology that underpins and frames such reality TV pairs capitalism and democracy as mutually constitutive, one paving the way for the other. In contrast to the undemocratic patronage systems that sometimes sustain the political economy of some of these television productions, the television projections in these shows are characterized by celebratory images of neoliberal capitalist entrepreneurships and oftentimes equate things such as voting for your favorite singers with choosing elected leaders. Lastly, this is also a popular genre, which is news, public information campaigns, political satire, and talk shows, which serve an entirely different function. Whereas the overlapping interests of Western corporations and international donor organizations are responsible for producing Afghan versions of Western reality television programs, locally produced political talk and satire shows are low in cost and enable smaller local businesses to advertise. Despite their despite their modest production values, they are as popular with viewers and serve an important function. After experiencing over 4 decades of warfare and trauma, Afghan audiences have very high expectations of media and journalism in general, and television in particular. These audiences want television to bring justice and retribution to local and international warlords who have been sowing the seeds of war, gender violence, and sectarian strife for decades. With public service announcements, public information campaigns, the news, and political satire, I argue media makers uncover, investigate, and expose corruption, abuses of power, and violence by local and international warlords and government officials. And to conclude, after experiencing over 4 decades of war, Afghans are traumatized and have high expectations of media. My conclusion is that Afghan media producers are delivering and meeting those high demands. Without a doubt, the combined power of protests and public broadcast media is a very effective social tool for collective action in Afghanistan. Yet there is a huge cost to this emergence and quick expansion of a public sphere. Violence against media makers continues to be a big problem. They are subjected to threats, physical attacks, and deaths for providing people with programming they want to watch. If violence against media makers continues to increase without any real consequences, it does not bode well for the future of Afghanistan. Currently, self-censorship is becoming more and more prevalent amongst media makers I interviewed. For these reasons, which include increasing violence against media makers and the attrition in international development aid in favor of more military expenditures, the future of media and therefore the future of Afghanistan is uncertain. As the only counterbalance to the government, warlords, and foreign interests in Afghanistan, the media is the only hope for providing a semblance of justice, debate, and healing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wazhmah. That was excellent. These were both just very excellent and visually rich presentations. Thank you both very much. I see some wonderful questions coming in through the Q&A box. And while we're waiting for a few more people to gather their thoughts in the Q&A, I thought I would take a moment and offer my comments on some of the larger and even overlapping themes both of you have discussed in your presentations, and that might serve as an avenue for further conversations we can have. So first is this project of nationalism, right? And nation building that occurs at these two different moments. There's post-partition Pakistan and then post 9/11 Afghanistan, whose media choices reflect back or recall this earlier history from the 50s and 60s. And Wazhmah, you gave us some discussion of this, and I know it plays out more in your books, so maybe that's a point you can trace for us later. So there's this sense that how the nation is grappling with its own identity and how mass media then showcases these disjunctures and fissures within this moment of nation making and identity formation, right? And then another theme I see reflected in both of your work is this reliance on media to cultivate a national culture and cement official ideologies, but also to serve as a platform to introduce different kinds of visual and oral expressions, oral as in hearing, whether, in the remix that Salma discusses, or these popular dubbed serials that Wazhmah discussed in brief. And so there are these aesthetic and narrative choices that come into play as we delve into questioning what is being regulated, promoted, and garnering public appeal on screen, and why. Um, and then finally, there's also this question of transnationalism and the regional and global influences that shape media in each of the contexts we've learned about here. And that's something I'm very interested in asking you both about, because it seems very clear to me that we cannot speak about media in either of these contexts without taking into account these outside forces, of course, that have shaped spectator choices and preferences. And so I would like to start off by asking each of you to comment on how your respective projects can help us situate this larger tension over the question of sovereignty and identity. Feel free for either Salma or Wazhmah to begin, and we can.
Thank you, Mejgan, for those great questions. Really gets at the core of I think what we're both thinking through, and there's much to unpack. So I'll just start with taking a little part of that, which is that as you mentioned, these national media projects in many ways cement national ideology, or it's what the nation projects back to itself, right? And so one of the questions is, how much control do an agency do media makers have to create this collective national identity, right? And what is the role of the state actors, as well as non-state actors and corporations and so forth? And I can say in the case of Afghanistan and especially post 9/11 media, but also in earlier time periods, which I know you study as well, in the 60s and 70s, the state took an active role in trying to promote the arts and media and culture. And in post 9/11 era, more and more people are also have access to be not just viewers, but also media makers. But the tension comes for the state currently in the post 9/11 era, where the media takes on a role, which is the role it should take in a democratic society of a third state, or what's called a fourth state, where they also begin to challenge the state, the nation state, and the government, right? So they become almost an extension of the will of the people. They provide a watchdog function in terms of projecting people's voices and concerns and desires, and especially in a not just war torn, but actively, it's a war zone country, this is really important. And so those were some of my findings, and is that there is this tension between the media and these other state and non-state actors, which is a good thing, because that's the way it should be in environments that are free media environments, where you have independence and freedom of speech.
Salma.
Yeah. So, well, because my research looks at the very moment of national formation, right? What is happening more so in Pakistan is that there are certain functions that the Pakistani state is fulfilling, right? So, for instance, it takes over studio property that has been left by migrating personnel, and decides to allocate it to the ones who arrive from Bombay. So those kinds of functions are being fulfilled by the state, or the custodian of the evacuee property. But at the same time, they are not financing films, right? And the facilities are not up to date. So you can see in the newspapers at that time, or even in the discussions, that the producers are saying, we don't have the right equipment, the state needs to help us. At the same time, in the late 50s, with General Ayub's period, and also the formation of the Inquiry Committee for Film, which is in the late 1960-61, you see that the state is trying to at least project itself as, concerning itself with the affairs of the film industry, so-called. But of course, it's recommendations, and these are all kind of, talking down to the producers. So the recommendations are kind of very, you also see that in India at this, but they're almost like, oh, this is undue veneration of foreign films. We need to build national character through inspiring tales. But as personnel in the film industry also realize, how do you build such a national character? Where do you get this repertoire from? And for instance, a writer from Bombay who moved to Pakistan says, well, talking about a Pakistani cinema or a national cinema before actually making films is like, trying to quench one's thirst before digging a well, so it's this idea of how do you create this. So there's always that tension, but at the same time, by the filmmakers and actors, there's a desire to project a national film industry, because they realize that with the Bombay imports, because it's the same language, until 47, everybody's watching the same films pretty much. So the desire to have their own film industry means that you need to have a restrictive market where there's a chance for them to make their own films. So the actors and the producers want a restricted market, whereas the distributors and exhibitors want an open market, because for them, incoming Indian films means, profit. So what emerges in these exchanges is also a really divided national industry. The fact that there is no such industry as such, and the interests are divided based on where the profits are coming from.
Thank you both so much. Those were illuminating answers, and just remind me of also during the same time period in the 50s and 60s when Afghans were importing both Pakistani and Indian films, and sort of the same sort of negotiations that Salma highlighted for us were also happening in the neighboring country. So we do have a number of wonderful questions in our Q&A. I'll begin. There's a question for Salma from Professor Priya Setia in the Department of History. And she is interested in knowing a little bit more about Ratan Kumar's story. And she'd like to know, did he keep his star name Ratan in Pakistan? And was the decision to move his own, oh, the question, excuse me. Was the decision to move his own or a larger family decision? And finally, are there many cases of cross-border film projects before 1965? And she's referring to Faiz's Jago Hua Savera. And thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for the question. Sorry, the question has disappeared, so I'll try to answer as soon whatever I can remember of it. But so yes, Ratan Kumar did keep his name, Ratan Kumar, in Pakistan. And in fact, his arrival was announced very much in terms of a migrant arrival, that he has come from India, and that he was very recognizable. So he kept his name, Ratan Kumar. The decision to migrate, and this is a very tricky thing, this is what I deal with my work, the choice or the decision to migrate. How do you arrive at such a decision? But in terms of Ratan's migration, of course, the entire family migrates. And as soon as he arrives in Pakistan, what one can see in the reports and the magazines is that his father becomes really prominent in a lot of interviews with Ratan. So one can see it, of course, as a decision made by his family, but it was also a decision that kept Ratan at the center. So his father appears in a lot of these interviews and says, well, there was a lot of pressure on us from filmmakers in Pakistan who said Ratan must come to Pakistan. So the family sort of declares or justifies their decision to migrate because Ratan would get a better chance in the film industry there. In terms of more cross-border collaborations, well, there is certainly the instance of Miss 56, which was a film made by Roop K. Shori and Meena Shori. And that's a very interesting story because Roop K. Shori was actually a producer in Lahore who had left at the time of partition. He was a non-Muslim and he had to leave, arrives in Bombay and makes these romantic comedies with his wife Meena Shori. And then in 56, the husband and wife go to Pakistan and just want to make, they decide to make a film with J.C. Anand there. It's called Miss 56. So that could be seen as one instance. The other, actually, the newspapers at this time and film magazines at this time mentioned this character, Krishna Kumar, who's shuttling between India and Pakistan. And eventually, I think he settles in Bombay because he really disappears from these records. And it's his collaboration with Ataullah Hashmi, which often comes to fore. So they are like a team. So he comes from India, makes these films in Pakistan, goes back, and there are discussions whether his visa will be extended or not. So yeah, there are these instances, definitely.
Thank you so much. We have another question. This one is for Wazhmah, and it's from Professor Robert Cruz in the Department of History. He has two questions for you, Wazhmah. To what extent does the popular genre of dramatic serials address questions of ethnic and or religious difference? And how would you characterize the politics of Tulul in relation to the broader political frameworks you introduced? So imperialism, capitalism, and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz, for those great questions. So these are some of the things I explore in the book in terms of the ethnic and religious contestations with these foreign imports. That was something I was trying to make sense of, right? Prior, I would say, to Khat Sayom and some of these other Afghan productions that have become popular, Indian soap operas or dramatic serials were the most popular. And so and to a degree, Iranian ones and Turkish ones are very popular too. So how do Afghans identify or disidentify with them? And it's quite complex because they would say things like, acknowledge that, oh, they're Hindus and we're not Hindu, but then at the same time they would say things like, but because of the domestic sphere and issues around, marriage and family life and all of these things that are very important parts of Afghan everyday life, that they felt this connection. And so one of the concepts I talk about is this idea of Sangin and Rangin, and how the Iranian ones are very Sangin and have the dark colors and the dark chadars. And even though if you look at the content, the women may be more liberated in certain sense, but the stylistic choices made it so audiences, especially I would say city audiences from Kabul who remembered the time of the Taliban and Mujahideen oppression, they did not relate to it. Whereas the more Rangin, lavish styles and the Indian ones, they felt were liberating, even if in fact sometimes the content was not. So I can go on and on in terms of the Turkish ones and all the other ones, because they're all have their own complex issues of identification and disidentification. But in the interest of time, I'll go on to talk about Tolo briefly. And, Tolo I talk about in great detail in the book, Tolo TV, part of the Moby Media Group. Tolo is one of the stations that has received and continues to receive US aid money. And this is something that, and of course, they're also popular, and they also have much of their funding come from advertisers as well. So this is not to say that they're entirely funded by Western development communication money, but that is one source of their revenue. And they have, popular programming across genres, but at the same time, in my research with them and my interactions with them, they did not share this information, and they did not want this information about where their funding comes from to be public. But there's enough information out there that I could put the pieces together. And that was something I found with most TV stations, is that on the one hand, they solicit donor aid money. On the other hand, they don't want to be deemed by audiences and viewers to be in the pocket of this nation or that nation. And so they disown it on the other hand. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Wazhmah. So we have another question for Salma, and this one is from Professor Usha Iyer from the Department of Art and Art History. She says, I really appreciated your emphasis through the charba on entanglement rather separation between post-partition India and Pakistan. Do the contiguities of region via Punjab and Bengal across new national borders play a significant role in these entanglements? That is, what are the longer histories of entanglement between the Bombay and Lahore film industries and their personnel that play into these charbas and repeated narratives? I'm wondering if repetition rather than remake helps read them differently. And secondly, as a child immigrant figure, a national orphan, how does Ratan Kumar's child actor status inflect his replication in double roles and his doubling as a model citizen of both nations across these decades? And did he continue to be billed as Ratan Kumar in Pakistani cinema?
Thank you, Usha, for these wonderful questions. I hope I can answer them. So, yes, of course. I think the contiguities of regions, especially Punjab, as far as my research is concerned, is there in these repetitions. So, for instance, a lot of Punjabi films that are being made in Lahore after partition are drawing on the Qissa Dastan stories which were popular in the region and drawing on the vernacular tradition of the region. And therefore, yes, I agree that repetition is inherent there, but there's also a remaking in the sense that there is a clear, the filmmakers are very conscious of the changed demography. There are certain things you can do now in post-partition Pakistan that one could not do in an all-India market. And that's why I would say that the repetition involves a lot of remaking as well. And for instance, a lot of these writers, especially the Parsi theatre writers, who then who were writing for films in Bombay, then migrate to Lahore and are writing there, have seen the trade and have seen how this works. So there are lots of small shifts that one can see in these remakes, for instance, in Gulba Kauli, where certain things could be done in the name of, let's say, majorly a Muslim nation that you could not do in an all India film. So it's not a simple. It's basically laying claim to a common tradition, but also remaking it to the changed national situation. Child actor status inflect his replication. If I understand it correctly, one of the things is that at this time, and this is the global cinema influence, the post-war cinema in, for instance, Italy, the child, the male child becomes this sign of, sort of standing on the crisis, the rubble of masculinity, so to speak, so it's standing in for hope, it's standing in for, rebuilding. And but the doubling, for instance, I don't know if it is to compensate for his age, or I read it more in terms of the fact that it is a confrontation of identity, and sort of recognizing a past act, carrying it along in the new nation, and sort of making a distinction that, there are two selves. There's an unconscious self, and, there's a new self that one is trying to make. So, and yes, he was billed as Ratan Kumar.
Thank you, Salma. Professor Iyer also has a question for Wazhmah. Are South Korean and Pakistani TV shows popular in Afghanistan? And are there regional differences in media consumption depending on proximity to the border with Iran or Pakistan?
Thank you for that question. I'll start with the second half of the question, or that if there's regional, based on the proximity, if there's regional connections. And I would say that not all of the neighboring countries' media is well represented, but some are. So as I mentioned, India and Iran have a good bit of representation. I haven't seen as much from the northern stans, Tajik, although in terms of music and other things, there's a good bit of crossover, but not so much in terms of TV shows. So I'm talking about Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. And then in terms of Pakistan, I've seen more recently, there's been a great deal of Pakistani dramatic serials that Afghans, are gravitating towards. One thing they can say is, well, they also are Muslim and were Muslim, but in a certain sense, they all have a secular sensibility. And then other than that, there's more, some more religious dramatic serials, which is a whole other case study. So I think, South Korean, yes. There was one or two South Korean, and there was a Japanese one briefly too. There were more epic sagas, I would say, as opposed to the more soap operatic dramatic serials.
Thank you so much, Wazhmah. Now back to you, Salma. There's a question from Professor Isabel Huacuja Alonso asking if you could talk a bit more about the barriers of pursuing research that crosses national borders, particularly during the current political moment.
Thank you. And I think Isabel can talk about it herself. I must say that I did most of my fieldwork before the political climate, if I may say so, became more difficult for researchers to do these kinds of research. So I think if I were to start as a PhD student now, it would be even more challenging for me. But having said that, the visa regimes were never easy on either side, for researchers from Pakistan wanting to do research in India or vice versa. So there's one thing to be said about visa regimes and how do you do research in these, just the pragmatics of doing this kind of research. But the other thing is also, I think, which is good for any researcher, the amount of healthy and unhealthy suspicion that you are met with in both sides, in India or in Pakistan, as if that by crossing borders, you're actually doing something that is extremely subversive, and there has to be some ulterior motive as to why you're crossing these borders. So I think while of course a lot of people are extremely supportive, and especially the academic community, I think in terms of the political climate, it becomes, you have to title your talks in a particular way, you have to speak in a very careful manner, you can never be careful enough, and you're doing something fairly, you think, harmless. You're talking only about media and something that happened in the past, but somehow it's you're all a little bit on the edge when you're sharing your research. So, and of course, I won't even get into archives and how do you start accessing these archives and how do you carry these archives back with you. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for maybe one more question. And what I'll try to do is I'll give the last question to Wazhmah, and we will sort of try to lump some themes together. So the question is, what narratives are censored by the Afghan government or self-censored by the media companies in producing media programs such as dramas? And then tacking on to that, what do you think about the role of television in the construction of inferior identity for Afghan women? And for example, in the comedy shows like Shabake Khanda.
Thank you. I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to address them quickly, and I'll start with the last one since it's fresh in my head, with the sometimes inferior characterization of women and some of the political satire and comedy shows like Shabake Khanda. And I'll say that I think we're in this current moment where it's almost like anything goes. And so, especially in these comedy programs and political satire, people, the makers and the actors and actresses are not necessarily trained, and they're trying all kinds of things, right? So it's a competitive market. They're competing with other places, other TV stations, and some of the devices that they use, which is drag, so men often dressing as women, and these caricatures that are unflattering of older women, younger women, all types of mothers, daughters, and so forth, are unflattering. But I think that we will see a shift as more people enter the field and as people become more trained in the media, because much of our earlier media industry was destroyed in so many years of war. And so we really are in a new moment of emerging media. And so in terms of the questions about both government censorship and self-censorship by media makers, I'll take a quote from Salma and say that, it's similar to us researchers and scholars. When you're sharing your research, you're always a little bit on the edge because we're dealing with heavy topics that have political dimensions. And so in a way, when you become a public figure, you also become a public target. And so I noticed, because my fieldwork spans from 2008 to 2014, and I'm still in touch with many of my contacts, that over time, many people began to self-censor, and they would tell me that they're beginning to self-censor, and specifically in terms of challenging warlords and government officials, and also international warlords, as I call them, because they are getting targeted more and more, and very few arrests happen, and very few people are prosecuted for it. And then lastly, in terms of government censorship ranges from everything from, as I mentioned in my talk, what they call immorality, right? So if they're blurring women wearing saris, or, you know, in Turkish programs, if someone's neckline is too low, or this, to the more egregious types of censorship, which is trying to censor political programs and news and things that are critical. And so far, there's enough pushback and protests and enough media that, and also the media moguls themselves can challenge the government and courts, that there's a level of balance and media openness, but it's very, very fragile. So we'll see what happens in the future. I'll leave it there and say thank you to all of you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Wazhmah, and thank you, Salma, for these illuminating conversations. And, you know, just revisiting how much media has had an impact on shaping identity and ideas about the nation. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you all to our audience members for their wonderful questions and for joining us. And please do check out the CSA website, southasia.stanford.edu, for more information on our upcoming events. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.